And welcome again to Cottage Talk. I am Russ Goldman. This is another different type of episode that I'm doing. I'm going to be doing this on a regular basis. I'm calling this Fulham News and Notes, and this is for today, February 13th, 2023. I have three topics. One is news related, involves Kevin Mbabu. Another topic is the Tony Khan interview, which was on talkSport over the weekend. Can actually watch and listen to it on YouTube. Please do check that out. I would highly recommend it. I'm going to share my thoughts on that interview. And lastly, I'm going to share my thoughts on the situation with Tom Cairney and what does it mean for Fulham with his injury. Again, hearing different things about how long. I don't know how long, but how are Fulham going to deal with Tom Cairney potentially being out for a game or multiple games? So I'll be sharing my thoughts on that in this 15-minute episode of Cottage Talk. As always, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. Okay. So I also want to mention just a big thank you to everyone that has reached out to me in regards to my thoughts and Max's thoughts on the importance that Manor Solomon scored for Fulham. I just want to thank everyone. I also tweeted about that, and I had so many people liking it. I just want to thank everyone for liking my tweet and also sharing how you feel about what Max and I shared. So thank you, everyone, and I'll pass that along to Max as well. It was an emotional moment for us, Max and myself, to see Manor Solomon score for Fulham, and we shared that on the last show. Okay, so for this episode, I'm going to start by talking about Kevin Mbabu. And there is a report over the weekend from Fabrizio Romano that he is about to actually go out on loan to Servette in Switzerland and play for them for the rest of the season on loan. And if this does come to fruition, let me just start by wishing all the best to Kevin Mbabu if this move does happen. I have a feeling it might. The transfer window for Switzerland, I believe, is open until the 15th. So there is still time for this to happen. And listen, for whatever reason, it has not worked out with Kevin Mbabu and Fulham. Fulham had so many hits this summer, an incredible amount of hits. You're not going to hit on everyone. This was a miss. They missed on Kevin Mbabu. They needed backup at the right back position. And this just didn't work between the player and the club. It just didn't work out. Obviously, and this is my opinion, Marco didn't trust him. So when you get to that point, for whatever reason, didn't see enough in training, didn't see enough in the match or matches that he played, he wasn't going to play him. So then he had to move him along and also find a substitute, which now he has with Cedric Soares on loan from Arsenal. So in the end, I think it's going to work out for the player if he does make this move, and then also for the club. So let's see what happens. But if he does move to Switzerland for the rest of the season, I want to wish Kevin Mbabu all the best. Any player that plays for Fulham, I don't care how small time he does play for the club, I wish him the best. So we'll see what happens with Kevin Mbabu. Let's just be honest, just never worked with Fulham. And we'll see what happens for Kevin Mbabu. Okay, that was topic number one. Let's now move to topic number two. And this is an interview that Tony Khan did over the weekend at the Super Bowl with talkSport. I watched it this morning. I believe it was a couple days ago. But there's some interesting nuggets in there that I want to share with you my thoughts on. I would highly recommend going to YouTube and watching this 9-minute plus interview. It's 9 minutes on Fulham. It also talks a little bit about Manchester City. But the interviewer does ask Tony to share his thoughts on Fulham, and I'm going to share what I learned in this episode, what Tony had to share. So let's start here because I think this is interesting. So in this 9-minute interview, Tony Khan stated that he only talked to one candidate for the head coaching job, and it was Marco Silva. So there was a lot of speculation that Fulham were close to potentially signing another manager after the situation with Scott Parker leaving the club. And there was speculation with Steve Cooper and some other managers. And I was actually being contacted that Fulham were close to signing a different manager. Well, that never happened. So what's interesting here is that in this interview, Tony mentions that they only talked to one, and it was Marco. So for all that speculation that Fulham were in talks with other managers, if you're going to go based on this interview, wasn't right because they only talked to one, and that was Marco Silva. And anyone watching live will see that I made a little bit of an error spelling coaching. So there's a Goldman for you. But it's very interesting that it sounds like to me, once they started talking to Marco, that was it. They made up their mind, and it was just about getting him to sign with Fulham as their new head coach. It sounds like it was probably a negotiation to get Marco to sign, but I think very early on, once they had a conversation with Marco, this is my opinion, Shahid and Tony Khan made up their mind that they wanted Marco Silva. So that's why I think there was no other discussion with other managers. There might have been talk about it, but I think based on what I watched, they only really truly talked to one manager, and that was Marco Silva. Regardless of what you heard, this is coming from Tony. They only talked to one manager, and it was Marco. Marco was their number one choice based on what I watched on YouTube in this interview with Tony Khan. Very interesting because I thought that they were talking to several managers, and Tony comes straight out and says it was Marco. So there you go on that. So I thought I would mention that. I found that interesting from this interview on talkSport. Also, I'm just going to share this. This is actually a quote from Tony in this 9-minute interview. Tony Khan stated, quote, "When people talk to him, you want to play for Marco," unquote. So he does go into this situation where he's talking about recruitment a little bit. I'm paraphrasing, and the importance of Marco and the role that Marco played in the process, because basically he was talking about once Marco talked to the players, players wanted to play for Marco Silva. So that's where this quote comes from. So I'm going to talk a little bit afterwards coming from this interview. It sounds like Marco is very involved or has been involved in the recruitment part of players coming in. So, and what's interesting about this is that Tony makes it perfectly clear that once the player talks to Marco, they want to play for him. You know, again, that's his opinion. He's talking about how the players really want to play for Marco. And I think it comes from after talking to him. So based on the interview that I saw, it sounds like Marco was very involved. This is my opinion in what happened this summer and maybe before that as well. So very interesting stuff, because when you think of Marco, you think of him as just a coach. He's not just a coach. I think that the Khans and Marco Silva are really lockstep together. You can think what you want about either one of them. I'm talking about the Khans and, of course, Marco. But based on how things are going, I think that there is a partnership. And I want to talk about that coming up next because, again, this is the interview. This isn't my thoughts. This is more to do with the interview. But Tony talks a great deal about the partnership between him and Marco. Marco is the head coach. Tony is the sporting director of football. And they have, as he said, many Zoom calls. They talked about potential players. And I just want to just mention this, and again, I'm paraphrasing. Basically, it was very obvious that Marco is involved in this process, and the partnership between Tony and Marco was clear. If you listen to the interview, again, this is my opinion. I think it's pretty clear that Tony ultimately signs the players and Marco coaches them, but they do collaborate on the process. Tony is the coach, and Marco is the coach, and Tony ultimately signs the player. So let's make that clear. It's ultimately Tony Khan's decision, but Marco is involved. That's my opinion. Again, this is just from the interview. This is what I think is going on because we're wondering what is the relationship. And I think based on what I've listened to and also what I think I've been led to believe is that the roles are pretty defined. Marco coaches the team and Tony brings in the players, but they're both involved and they both talk in the recruitment part of Fulham Football Club. So I just thought I'd mention. And I think other people are involved in the recruitment process as well. I don't think it's just these two men, but I think it's pretty obvious. And if you look at the players that were brought in, I think Marco Silva had a much say into some of the players that came in, most of them. Who knows? Okay. So please do check out that interview. I would highly recommend checking out that interview with Tony Khan on talkSport. Whether you like him or you hate him, I think you're going to appreciate the interview because I think you're going to get some insight. That's my opinion. Okay. To finish up, I'm going to talk about the situation with Tom Cairney. And he came off of the Sunderland match with two people having to help him off the pitch. And very worrying to see that. And then in the presser leading up to the last match, Marco made it clear that Tom Cairney was out. So the question is, how long? Well, I've heard different things, so I'm not going to speculate on how long. I'm just going to say, I'm going to go with the idea that if he is out, what do Fulham do? Because I think Tom Cairney's potential loss could be significant. He has been that man that has come in for the last between 20 to 30 minutes and has really gave you this calmness when he's come onto the pitch, controlled the play. So what do you do when you don't have that player if he cannot play? And we'll see. Maybe he will be back for the next match. I don't know. But let's just go with the idea that he's not. What do you do? And here's my opinion on that. I think you have a couple options. I think you can play Harrison Reed for 90 plus minutes. I think he can go. He really was fantastic in the last match. I think if you needed him to do that, you can do that. But you don't have that switch up. You don't have that calmness. But you do have another option. And I think you do have that option in Sasa Lukic. Now, we only saw him for a brief period of time in the last match. But he is a different option from, I would say, Cairney and also from Reed. So let's see what happens with Tom Cairney. But the fact that they have Lukic in there, I think that gives you the other option, say, with 30 minutes to go. If you want to switch around central midfield a little bit and take Reed off, I think Lukic is your man. I think he is. We'll see what happens with Tom Cairney. I do wish him the best, and I hope he returns to playing for Fulham sooner than later. That's all I'm going to say on that. Let's hope he is okay. I really do. He's actually become a valuable player for Fulham Football Club this season. He really has. So let's hope Tom Cairney is okay. Okay. So let's see if we have any comments. Let's see. Here's one from my friend Steve Reynolds. With Portugal being a building ground for many players from South America, Marco was in a prime position. Yes, Steve, absolutely. That's why I think it's pretty obvious that Marco's involved here. It's very obvious in the recruitment part. When you see the players coming in, the Brazilian players, when you see the talk in Portugal, there's no question that Marco's involved. And I also wanted to mention, and I did mention during this, and I'm glad that Tony mentioned this, is that players want to play for Marco. So how do you know that? Let Marco talk to them. So it almost feels like to me, once Marco makes his pitch, a lot of these players want to play for Marco Silva. And it's funny because Manor Solomon even mentioned that in an interview. And you got Manor Solomon, and I know other players have mentioned it as well. So You can say what you want. I think Marco Silva is extremely involved in the recruitment process for Fulham. It might ultimately be Tony signing the players, but Marco's involved. So I'm glad that you said that. And for me, this also shows how much the Cons trust Marco and how much they're building a team for Marco. So for me, this is all good stuff for Fulham Football Club moving forward. Okay. Well, that's going to do it for this quick episode of Cottage Talk. Like I said, this is a new show I'm going to be doing on a regular basis. I'm calling it Full News and Notes. Please feel free to share your comments on a tweet to me if you liked it. Put it on Facebook, on YouTube. Did you like this style of show? I really would like to know. Okay. And as always, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. My name is Russ Goldman. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening to Cottage Talk, now part of the talkSport Fan Network.